In 2010, which you can just kind of see in the beginning, I was working on building a global macro trading program. And what that really meant was an investment program where we take positions in macro instruments like foreign exchange, interest rates, equity indexes, and energy. And in particular, energy, crude oil, and natural gas. And so we started trading our program in 2011. And by the beginning of 2013, I came upon an article on biophysical economics. And so I got very interested in it by virtue of the fact that we were heavily trading energy in the West Texas intermediary market, on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and also Brent crude, which at the time was traded on the ICE exchange. And so I came to the conference in the summer of 13 and got so excited about what I heard and what I learned, and came back kind of loaded with a new vision, perhaps, of how the economy might work. And we went to work on remodeling how we were trading energy from a macro standpoint. And we were looking very closely at how Asian demand was growing and driving the demand market. We were looking at the supply side and the supply constraints, peak oil, OPEC. And so we rebuilt our models, and by the spring of 2014, we came to the conclusion that, there's just not going to be enough oil. And the oil is going to end up being a rationing market with its price. And so our thesis was to take advantage of that. We needed to be bullish oil. We needed to really get aggressive oil. And so about mid-14, we started theorizing how we would put these positions on derivative markets, and we'd make bets out 1 year, 2 years, why not 3? Because there's not going to be any oil. And so just about the time that we got all the positions on, the market crashed. And so that was what I got from my first Biophysical Economics conference and its application to the real world. So it's taken me 5 years to recover, and now I'm back. So thank you for having me. So I wanted to really quickly kind of go over what I'm going to try to cover today and my inspiration for this. No joking aside, we did get long oil, but we survived because we had risk controls in place. But I did get left with a new vision of how the economy works, how the macro economy works. And I really got interested in this first from a modeling standpoint, and then about the startup world in new projects that might start to address some of these issues from an energy standpoint. So besides looking at the modeling side, I've got involved in several startup projects that involve cogeneration, ground transportation, and building mechanical systems. And they all kind of have a common thread in terms of energy and our use of energy. But today, when I saw that the conference was out and I submitted an abstract, I wanted to bring something out for us to talk about. And specifically, I wanted to come to see if there were people that might want to work on this problem with me. And so my goal today is to take us through an idea of, can we build a model, a benchmark biophysical economic model, with an idea in mind that we want to have institutional buy-in, and we ultimately want to affect policy. So my thinking is that until our work can be implemented in policy, it's really just academic. And so my interest and passion today in this presentation is to talk with you about that. And so let me get started here. So the goal is to create a benchmark model with biophysical economics. And some very simple ideas is it needs to be based on this new vision of how the macro economy works. We need to make it simple initially. So we don't want to get bogged down in hyper advanced mathematics and supersets of assumptions. I think we need to start simple, and we need to try to pick up the relevant dynamics, which are all the things we talk about at these conferences, was essentially is how is energy, how is oil, and these other energy sources integrated into economics? How exactly is that going on? And I then want us, though, to embark on this project of building this model with an end in mind. And that end in mind is twofold. One is we want to have a model that we can put in our briefcase and we can take to institutions. So we want to build institutional awareness. And there's not just one institution that's involved in this issue and this problem. There are institutions in finance, there are institutions in transportation, there are institutions in agriculture, and each of those may require a different twist on the model. But today I'm going to be focusing on the financial aspect of this. And I feel like it's an aspect that we need to address a little bit more heavily with this group. And then the second is that once we get institutional awareness, we want to be a part of policy activism. We want to have a seat at the table. We want to be a part of how these decisions and policies are being made to change some of the behavior patterns that we're seeing, the consumption patterns in energy, and how energy is running through the economy. So the institution that I've picked today to talk about is the Federal Reserve. And again, I want to emphasize this is not the only institution that has a stake in this game, but it's the one I'm going to focus on today. And the particular piece of policy that we're going to talk about is monetary policy, which comes out of the Federal Open Market Committee. So the Federal Open Market Committee is one committee within the Federal Reserve. And it is just simply one function of many functions of this institution. But I'm going to focus on it today because it is the piece of policy that is involved in regulating the macroeconomy. And therein lies where we want to talk about how do we meld the model with institutional awareness, because the Federal Reserve is building models and taking action and policy based on those models. So it's really important to understand that understanding monetary policy requires us to understand the operational details. And some of this stuff might seem boring, or why are we talking about this? But I believe that to have a seat at the table, to be part of the debate, we have to understand how the institution operates. What are its nuances? How do people get on the boards? How are decisions made? How is research cultivated throughout their system and brought up to these meetings? Who makes the macroeconomic presentations at the meetings? All of these details influence how policy is made. And then that policy has dramatic impacts on us. So the devil is in the details. And I believe that in building this model and embarking on that, we need to understand those details. And other institutions will have their own and other details as well. So I'm going to take us on a quick journey to talk about a piece of empirical economic research, very math intensive, that ended up into the policy pipeline, if you will, and then where that left us heading into the 07-08 crisis, and try to paint a picture as a base case of understanding how do you go from empirical work to policy to then implementation of that policy. And in this particular example, it'll be in the context of the 07-08 crisis. So we're going to start in 1977. There was a paper put out by Kindlin and Prescott. This was a very important piece of empirical work for you people who are publishers and research scientists. They won the Nobel Prize for this in 2004. So this is no small piece of work in the history of academics. But they published a paper on a subject about rules and discretion in making monetary policy decisions, even making a broader set of decisions. And what it was essentially this, that there exists some optimal decision at a point in time that maximizes social welfare, but there's also another path, a consistent path, a rule that is time invariant. So the optimal decision was discretion. And the rules, the consistent policy, was the rule. And their conclusion was, as a matter of a mathematical proof, that rules always trump discretion. So this was a major breakthrough in policymaking, in decision-making, and economic sciences. And this began a whole string of research, of mathematical models that took us forward. And the key implication of their finding was that expectations matter. That the economic agents will all be forming expectations about what our board, our policy board, is going to do. And they in turn will make decisions based on what they think the policymaker will do. Well, this was a major breakthrough. This was a major new way of thinking. And this ultimately had to be integrated into models. So expectations are all around us. One that I thought was interesting in Charlie's presentation about peak oil was how the expectation had changed due to fracking. So I just broke this up to look, what was the expectation for US crude oil production at this point? Well, this is where we went. So what was the expectation for US crude oil production at this point? And this is where we went. So expectations are changing. And I think that there is a piece of validity in that empirical work from 1977. The expectations do matter. And these expectations are shaping the way consumers make decisions about energy. And those micro foundations are ending up being macro outcomes. I want to give another quick example, because this one has really bothered me. I live in Atlanta, and we have a highway, Georgia 400, that runs north. And I included this because of the talk on sprawl.
Doesn't go south?
I'm sorry?
It goes north.
Well, for me, for my house.
Expectation.
And so it has always baffled me that people will sit in this line all morning, which of course is burning up fuel and taking time. And so I kept asking myself, what is the optimal policy decision about this? Well, in my mind, it was to extend our rail system. So our rail system stopped going north in the year 2000, but sprawl didn't. And so we recently had an announcement that our wonderful senators up in Washington had got us $140 million to study adding 2 more lanes, express lanes. And those express lanes are going to cost $1.4 to $1.8 billion to add 2 lanes out our major sprawl highway. Whereas we could add 14 miles of rail for about $125 million a mile. So I bring this up for a couple of reasons, because those are policy decisions that are getting set by a couple different institutions. One is our Congress, and the second is our Georgia Department of Transportation. So again, a set of institutions that are making policy decisions that are going to have a dramatic impact on what happens with energy. But they're also setting expectations for people. They're not making this decision because we think we're running out of oil. And they're not making this decision because they think the price of oil is going down. And that in turn is shaping expectations. So this brings us all the way to where we were before the financial crisis and how the Federal Reserve was making decisions. And all this work came together into something that was called forecast targeting. And it worked a little bit like this. As a central bank, you have to choose a policy rate. In our case, it's the Fed funds rate. It's the overnight rate of money. The next thing you got to do is you got to choose a path for it. You got to say, are we raising it? Are we lowering it? Are we keeping it steady? There's not a lot of options with what you can do with it. And you got to do it such that your forecasted target variables look good. And in our case, that is inflation. It's essentially price stability. And so to the extent that inflation is deviating from what they think the optimum should be, which is 2%, as measured by the personal consumption expenditures, you will either raise or lower and set a path. You should publish these forecasts, and you should justify the actions. And those last two really come out of this whole science of expectations, because to the extent that the public and the economic agents understand more of what the Fed is doing, they expect to have more control over the economy. And that control in their mind is getting actual monetary conditions to equal their desired monetary conditions. And so their method at this point is to attempt to move capital markets in certain directions to affect these outcomes. So all of this needed a model, because if you're going to be in the business of forecast targeting, you've got to make forecasts. So they came up with something called the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. It was probably created by a mathematician. I know there's a few here in the room. Very simply, it was dynamic because it took into account time. It was stochastic because you could shock it. You could run tests through it. It was general because it was macro. And it was equilibrium because it was in the house of Walrasian equilibrium. So we had the DSG, and the Fed has developed one since the 90s, and it's called the FRB-US model. And it's essentially their version of the model. They claim that it's more accurate, it has more parameters, it's more sophisticated, except for the fact that it does a terrible job of forecasting. And it really can't forecast anything in the medium or the long term, which of course is the objective of price stability, is to be stable in the medium and long term. So I apologize that this slide is long, but it ties a couple issues together about our building models and getting involved in policy. At the end of the day, the Kinlan and Prescott work really didn't matter, because the reality is that policy is not done based on a rule or based solely on discretion. At the end of the day, the way it's practiced is people's best judgment. So I use this as an example of where hard empirical research ended up into policymaking and ended up into model building. But at the end of the day, it really didn't reflect what was going on at the board level. And this is the kind of error that I would like to avoid in building a new set of models. The new set of models that I would like to consider working on with this group would be models that could actually be used in policymaking, as opposed to ones that really don't fit the script. So along came the Great Recession, which we're all aware of. We know the numbers about, we know what happened. It's widely reported that it was financial. Or was it thermal? And I'd like to suggest to you that the 07-08 recession, the roots of it were really an oil shock. It was an energy shock. And it took the financial community off guard because they really don't ever study it and they don't ever look at it. And they don't really have a way in their models with micro foundations to properly model the impact of an energy shock on the economy. And so this one got away from them. You can see it's not too hard to tell that our last major recessions were all involved with an oil price rise. I contend that the last one was the most dramatic energy shock that our economy has had. I think some of the best empirical research on this is by James Hamilton, but there are lots of issues that we can point at, that as the energy prices rose, car sales collapsed. And just that one transmission mechanism in the real economy had a major reverberating effect because of how big the car industry is in America. The second one was the mortgage crisis. It didn't necessarily begin as a financial crisis inside the city, but really on the suburbs, where transportation was a major component of the cost of owning that home because you had to make that commute I showed you earlier. Those were the first round mortgages that failed in the package derivatives.
Do you have a reference for that? Just
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it should be. And so it's my contention that this is a very important recession for us to look at and study, because it was our first and the largest, I shouldn't say first, our largest energy-based recession.
What about 73 and 79? He's aware of that.
Yeah, no, they were. Those were recessions. Yes.
Yeah, with huge oil price shock.
Yeah. Yes.
Engineer.
We started late. Can we save the comments to the end? Because we're going to run out of time.
Another, I think, important piece for us to understand as we build new models is we learned a lot in the 07, 08, I think, about the relationship between income and energy consumption. Really quick, this is a plot of GDP to energy consumption. We know this. It has changed over time in terms of the trend. The most recent period of 1985 forward here, you'll see the slope of 0.47. The next slide I'd like to show you, I think, is really important and telling. So this is consumer energy expenditures as a share of total personal expenditures. And what I'd like to point out is in the last recession, you'll see that the cost of energy rose to a level that we had not seen since the 70s, coming out of a very, very long downtrend. And I think what's important to recognize at this point, this is updated through the first quarter of this year, is that energy has never been cheaper relative to our income than it is today. And so this is also setting expectations. Because buying gasoline and cars and driving and commuting and transporting ourselves around is not a cost problem. We can afford to ignore the problem. So I think a lot of times when we ask ourselves in here, why aren't people paying attention? Why is this not a piece of policy debate? Well, it's because people can afford to ignore it. Very simply. And we can continue to build roads. But it's my contention that when prices rose to a certain level relative to income, this is what triggered our recession. And so in building new models and looking at this, I think this is a very important thing for us to focus on, which is at what point were the issues of elasticity and income cause people to stop purchasing on the energy side. Of course, we had the crisis, and so we had to have a commission to study it. I thought this was very interesting. The report that was issued by the commission was 670 pages long. It was exhaustive. We spent a lot of time and money. I just wanted to run through the key highlights. There was failures in financial regulation, breakdowns in corporate governance, key policymakers ill-prepared, after all this, ill-prepared for what they had, and systemic breaches in accountability and ethics at all levels. You notice what's missing. There's not a single highlight that has anything to do with energy and the energy shock. And it's my contention that the analysis of these issues, it is all done by people in finance. And so they will tend to find problems that are all related around finance. So looking where we really have, only the light of day, but not what is out there that we haven't studied. I really like this. For a Fed chairman that had actually done several interesting pieces of empirical work on energy, it caught him completely off guard. He really didn't take oil and energy into consideration, and in the aftermath of that, really didn't even have anything to say about missing that. Just hoped us well and hoped that mainstream America would get back on their feet. I thought this was another very interesting comment. Blanchard, a prominent economist, but even after studying what has happened with our models, we just can't let it go. And so I bring this slide up to talk about that these things are deeply embedded in the institutions, and they're deeply embedded in how policy is being made. And so to get a seat at that table, I encourage us to think that we've got to bring something better. We have to do a better job of modeling. There are some people now that are starting to speak up about these issues. Michael Munger, an economist at Duke, he's doing some interesting work on traffic and traffic economics. Hassenfelder, a theoretical physicist, doing some very interesting work in how physics has gotten off track with math-based models that are theoretical and that don't have an application to the real world. Joseph Stiglitz has a new paper out on the econometric models and their failings, which is a very interesting read. Campbell Harvey gave an address and gets into the pure statistical problems of economic research, p-hacking, these other things that are bringing up false outcomes for us to look at. And Judea Pearl, I think, is doing a very interesting line of work on causality. I think this is a really important thing for us to consider in model building, getting away from the statistical relationship and working on the math of causality. So this is actually a different line of math that brings that to the table. At the end of the day, the models need to be applicable to the real world, and they need to get us a seat at the policy table. And until we build those models and present them to the institutions, it's going to be very hard for us to get traction and make change. So to conclude our biophysical macro model, we want to start with a vision. We want to build off the operational details of the institution that we want to present it to. Let's get away from micro foundations. If we're going to have them in our models, let's at least get the relationships correct, as opposed to just making bad assumptions and telling people our model works because we do have micro foundations. Consider the macroprudential. These are talking about the things that maybe we can't capture in a model. Rather than having a model that is not complete, there might be things that we need to do on the macroprudential side. In the banking sector, this is the control of credit. It's the idea that no matter how we set the Fed funds rate, we can't keep banks from making bad loans. So it's a macroprudential issue that we have to get into the banks as a supervisor and come up with a policy to keep them from making bad loans. So something we can't control with policy that we put in this other bucket. That may be applicable to what we're doing with energy. And last is an area that I just have an interest in, is thinking about an energy price of money. We've come this far thinking of kind of 4 prices of money: the par price, the future price being the interest rate, the foreign exchange price of money, and a commodity price of money. But traditionally in banking, the commodity price of money has been gold, which obviously is gone. But perhaps we need an energy price of money, a new way to think about it.
6 megajoules per dollar.
Yeah, so it's not, in our history, we've been changing how money is valued. We've been changing the basis of money. There's no reason for us to think we can't keep evolving that and have energy at the table in that. So it's an area of the model building and research I have a particular interest in, and I think should be a part of it. So at the end of the day, we can have our models and we can have our expectations, but as we've learned, life doesn't always work that way and meet up to our expectations. And so we can't throw out judgment and good homework. And I'm happy to share the reference.
Thank you. Now,
are. Great. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Benjamin Leiva. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics in the University of Georgia. What I will be presenting today is the first chapter of my dissertation, which attempts to build a theoretical framework to study the economic importance of energy. My interest in this topic started when I was a freshman in my undergrad studies in economics in Chile. It was a plain economics program in a pretty prestigious school in Latin America. And I came across the ecological crisis first, became very concerned and aware of it, and that basically changed my career path. I didn't change career, but I did started to get very uncomfortable with the models I was being taught. I got this gut feeling that there was something missing. I knew it was the incapacity to interpret the ecological crisis, right? The models were all very nice and efficiency and welfare maximizing, but when I was reading about climate change, deforestation, biodiversity loss, things didn't kind of click very well. But I didn't know what was actually missing until I came to my last year of the program, and I came across reading a ecology textbook. When I came specifically across trophic structures and food chain, it clicked to me. Energy was the protagonist that was missing in all the models I had been taught all these years. And then I started to read, well, what had been done, and I came across Charles' work and Clint's work and Georgescu Rogan's work. But I realized that there wasn't a proper dialogue between mainstream economics and this energetics literature that had been developed trying to understand the role of energy in society and in economics. And so I decided to do my PhD dissertation in an attempt to establish that link. Now, why is that relevant? Sometimes I think it's a lost cause because, well, economists are very, very narrowed down on their way of thinking, and they think energy is not relevant, so whatever. But I still have the idea that economists first are a very big group of people, so having them on board would be very valuable. Second, they're an influential group of people that have access to policy-making positions and to modify public opinion. And third, I still think that some methods used by economists are powerful and would be valuable to bring into this type of analysis that we're concerned about dealing with energy specifically and the ecological crisis in general. Now, the motivation that I am using in this first part of the dissertation, trying to bound this into an academic context, is, well, there is this empirical regularity between embodied energy and prices. That was first documented by Constantin Herendeen. I was pretty excited to meet him, but, well, that didn't work. That was later showed again around 20 years later by Liu et al. And this is for a group of metals. And then it was shown again around 5 years ago by Gutowski et al. For an array of different materials. So there's this empirical regularity between market prices and embodied energy, that is, the total energy required to produce goods. And yet it is very obvious that conventional economics cannot predict this. There's nothing in economic theory that allows us to interpret why that correlation exists. For mainstream economists, energy is not a relevant variable, right? It's not part of Economics 101, it's not part of the most advanced PhD level class, it is just not part of the framework with which economists understand the functioning of the world. And thus, naturally, it cannot interpret this type of evidence, or of empirical regularity, at least. Now, to be fair, for energy economists, energy is a relevant variable, but the theoretical approach taken has been to consider energy an input in production, and studied using an expanded production framework that considers, apart from capital and labor, which are the typical factors of production, energy and sometimes materials, the so-called CLEM models. That approach has been well recognized in the sense that it has been published in top journals in economics and in energy economic subfields. But it has not been very successful in the sense that the main topics of research have yielded widely inconsistent results. For example, studies on the elasticity of substitution between energy and capital, the causal path between energy and GDP, results are all over the place. But specifically on the correlation that we're focusing on, the study of the cost share of energy in production has been consistently low. That's one of the few consistent results that it has shown. And that implies quite the contrary, that there should be no correlation whatsoever between prices that, on theory, are supposed to reflect costs and embodied energies, given that energy is not a relevant factor in production. And that is why, for mainstream economists, energy is invisibilized in their models, because it's considered that, well, if it's just 5% typically the cost share in production, then it's not relevant, we can omit it, and it's not such a bad emission, right? So the specific questions that I am interested in answering is, well, can we build a formal model that hypothesizes this correlation? That's the first thing, very precise question. Then, can we do it with conventional economic procedures? This is an attempt to be able to dialogue with mainstream economics, to kind of bring it to their field and say, hey, look, with your way of thinking, with your methodology, we can integrate energy analysis, we can interpret this empirical regularity, and perhaps that will allow a conversation that today is largely absent. The ignorance by economists of biophysical economics and ecological economics and energy theories of value and peak oil is daunting. I have been living in that world for several years now, and it is really something that is invisible to me. And finally, as a broad objective is, can we have a better understanding of the specific role that energy plays in economic systems, and how with a model of this nature? As a preview of results, fortunately, it can be done, or at least that's what I will suggest. A model can be built that first hypothesizes explicitly the proportionality between prices and embodied energy, although it doesn't in a specific form that I'll show later. It shows several things, but as highlights that prime mover accumulation is a prime determinant of short-term growth, while it is the availability of energy, specifically of greater than one energy returns over investment that allow long-term growth. And given that it specifies what and when energy is a key determinant of economic expansion. Now, for this model, there are three concepts that we have to discuss before we can make sense of it. The first one is that goods are material rearrangements. This is a quite unquestionable fact, but that has gone under the radar in economics in general, and I feel also in the discussion in heterodox economics. When we think about any productive process, and here I have the example of cement production, what we're actually looking at is the rearrangement of molecules in raw materials and their reorganization into specific forms that we can recognize as the final output. We take whatever is in the quarry and we modify their molecular composition, we pass it through a system that constantly shifts and rearranges and attaches and deattaches and grinds and et cetera, the molecular composition of raw materials into cement in this case. And then we can take that cement and we mix it up with steel and we arrange a building. Or we take plastics and metals and we arrange a car. Every single good that we are consuming has been taken from raw materials. That is matter that is out there in nature spontaneously. We take it, we rearrange it, and we form it into specific orders or structures that satisfies our desires. Now, the relevance of that recognition comes from the second key concept, that material rearrangements can only be achieved through energy transfers. It doesn't matter what type of energy transfers, because, of course, there are a lot of them, but there is a fundamental principle, which is that if there's any material rearrangement taking place, there is an associated energy transfer that allows it. If there's no energy transfer, there's no material change in nature. And there's no wiggle room in that assertion. That is something that is fantastically ignored by mainstream economists. And for me, it was a wide revelation when I came across this idea. But it was interesting that I commented it with my girlfriend. She's a chemist, and she was like, "What's new, man?" And I was like, wow, I feel so underwhelmed by myself now. Now finally, energy transfer. These energy transfers that are required for material rearrangements can only be done by prime movers, right? And this brings a central variable of interest to the model that I'm going to be talking about. Prime movers are defined as any physical system that can transfer energy. They can be biological, us, we are prime movers, or horses or donkeys, and they can be mechanical, non-biological, as gas turbines, induction motors, diesel engines, or even computers. Any system that can take an energy good, electricity, rice, oil, right, take their energy content and transfer it to rearrange matter and produce goods. That is a prime mover. Now with these three concepts, we're about ready to start with a formal model, but first two assumptions. We always have to put some type of assumptions into the game, even if they're unrealistic. It's just part of model building. The first one is that energy goods provide no utility. This is a simplifying assumption that can be lifted in future more complicated models. I have already started doing that, but it simplifies the exposition, and it's not such a bad assumption when we consider that the bulk of an agent's energy income comes from non-utility yielding energy. So think about oil, right? We get utility from food, but we don't get utility from oil. And oil provides the bulk of our energy income today. The second one is that we'll be talking about an autarkic and single period agent. Autarkic agent is some agent that doesn't exchange with anyone. So everything consumed has to be produced by itself, and everything that it produces, it must be consumed by itself. So it's the idea that Graham discussed by the end of his talk that, well, to start this analysis, we have to start with the big picture. It is more simple. It's a natural starting point to think about the whole system, and then starting from there, we can think about portions of it and how they interact. But in this first exposition, I'll just go with the autarkic agent as a whole. Now, let's assume that this agent has a set of preferences that can be represented with a well-behaved utility function that is strictly increasing in a set of non-energy goods. So in that sense, this is extremely conventional. Extremely conventional. There's nothing new. Novelty comes from the constraint on that consumption, on that utility maximization, which is an energy budget constraint. And that's the point of departure that I am suggesting against conventional economics. That an autarkic agent's constraint is an energy budget constraint. What that is saying is that the average embodied energy of all the non-energy goods that the agent consumes has to be less or equal than the agent's energy surplus. The logic...
What was that last word? Service?
And energy surplus.
Surplus.
Surplus. I'll define that immediately. So the logic of that energy budget constraint comes from the key concepts defined above. If we don't recognize that goods are material rearrangements and the material range can only take place with energy transfer, right? It doesn't make sense to propose that, well, average embodied energy are crucial in determining the consumption possibilities of agents, okay? Now, if we focus on this energy surplus, we see that, well, this energy surplus is going to be the difference between the energy income provided by energy goods and the total energy transfer required to produce them. So the energy income is energy content times the quantity of each energy good, E, minus the total energy transfer, GE, summed over all energy goods, right? Now, if energy surplus is the constraint on consumption, then naturally, for the agent to maximize utility, it must maximize energy surplus. That's just Pareto efficient. And so we're not saying that energy surplus is valuable per se, but that it is required for utility maximization. So it is the recognition of the material basis of production that allows us to recognize that there is a derived energy surplus maximization objective that is required for utility maximization. Now, focusing on the relation between the quantity produced and the total energy transferred to produce that quantity, we have to talk about prime movers. If we define a set of prime movers by X, then the total energy required to produce whatever quantity of goods is going to be given by omega times X. Right? The G is going to be omega times X, where omega is the total energy transferred by a prime mover. That total energy transfer includes both direct energy transfers. Think about a tractor doing work on a field, right? It's burning oil to rearrange the earth to be able to plant something later, for example. But also indirect energy transfers, which is the embodied energy of the tractor itself, right? The tractor doesn't come to be spontaneously, you have to produce it, and you have to transfer energy to produce it.
Clarifying question, are the X's what are sometimes called activity levels?
No, the X's are quantity of prime movers. So 5 tractors, 10 people,
Okay,
20
then-
computers, right?
oh.
So it's a vector,
Yeah.
and each X is a type of prime mover, and they're just quantity, right? So the
Yeah.
omega is the total energy transferred by each unit. So this omega times X is the total energy transferred by all the prime movers.
Got it. Thanks.
Now, this same set of prime movers are going to be able to rearrange matter and produce goods. And the relation between quantity of prime movers that are combined to produce goods and the quantity of good produced are given by a production function, which we assumed also is well behaved, right? So prime movers are in the intersection between an agent's energy transfer capacity and the agent's capacity to produce goods. Now, at any given point in time, an agent has a limited amount of prime movers, right? It has 10 people, 2 tractors, right? You can't have whatever amount you want to produce. And so this energy surplus maximization problem is actually a constraint problem. The first constraint is the prime mover constraint. There are so many people you can employ, so many tractors, so many computers. That's the first one. The second one is a constraint that explicitly takes us away from energy theories of value, as it states that energy surplus is worthless if you cannot use it in the production of utility yielding non-energy. That's what the second constraint is telling us, that the amount of energy surplus has to be useful. And that's why it contains the amount of prime movers you have in the production of non-energy goods times the direct energy they can transfer. As a simple example, if you produce 100 tons of rice, but you have people enough to consume 50, you're going to just waste the other 50. If you don't have enough people to use that energy in the production of utility yielding goods, then it is pointless to produce those 50 extra tons in the first place. If you combine those constraints, set up a Lagrange and take the first order condition, you get this expression that is fairly complicated, but just as some fast review, it contains a measure of prime mover constraint, which I call power constraint. It contains energy goods, energy content, marginal embodied energy. Marginal embodied energy is how much the total energy transfer changes if we change production by 1 unit. And the marginal technical requirements of production function, which is the inverse of the marginal productivity. Now, we can rearrange this pretty nasty expression into this nice one, which tells us that at optimum, the production of energy goods will yield this relation in which energy content of an energy good equals its marginal embodied energy plus marginal energy surplus. Now, marginal energy surplus is another word for net energy, and thus is related to EROI, the energy return on investment, if we divide it by the marginal embodied energy. And so on the left-hand side, we have the marginal EROI, the marginal energy return on investment, that is equal to 1 plus this alpha, which is the marginal energy surplus, over the marginal embodied energy.
Why marginal?
Because it is the marginal embodied energy is how much total energy transfers change when you increase production by 1 unit.
Oh, okay.
Right? So this is what allows us to connect with marginal analysis, which is the mainstay of conventional economics. Right? For a conventional economist, if you're not talking about marginal analysis, you're not talking about economics. Right? So this is a way in which we can include marginal analysis in the type of conversations we want to have. Now, what is going on? Because algebra is always hard to follow, and graphs are much friendlier always, right? On the x-axis, we have quantity produced. On the y-axis, we have energy. So the MEEC is the marginal embodied energy curve, which shows what's the marginal embodied energy in the production of the good at each level of production. And thus it can vary, right? At low levels, it can be higher than at medium levels, but eventually it will go up. It's the idea that any technical improvements are eventually overwhelmed by the depletion of the resource, right? The idea that zero is eventually downward, it goes down to 1. Well, that's a marginal embodied energy that goes up.
What's S?
What's what?
S?
That's delta, which is the energy content. Right? And the energy content is fixed because it's an intensive property of energy. A barrel of oil has 40 gigajoules, more or less, right, at any level of production. And so at any point in time, the equilibrium condition that I showed before in the equation is going to be represented by this dynamic. Now, what is this showing us? The black line is the demand curve, and it shows that the maximum willingness to transfer energy to produce this good is going to be equal to the energy content up to the point where the amount of energy goods saturates the agent's prime mover capacity. Now, this is hard to follow, but it's the idea that you're going to produce 50 tons of rice if you can use 50 tons of rice. You're not going to produce 100 tons of rice if you can only use 50. Right? So demand falls vertically at the quantity of the energy good that saturates the agent's power rate, the agent's capacity to transfer that energy goods production. And so the intersection between the marginal embodied energy curve and this demand is going to give you the equilibrium point, which is going to be where gamma E is, right? Now, gamma E is going to be less than delta, than the energy constant, and that difference is the marginal energy surplus. The total energy surplus is the dashed space, and that is the amount that the agent can use in the production of non-energy goods. In other words, it is the surplus that the agent produces in the production of energy goods that allow for the production of non-energy goods, such as building pyramids, having universities, or having militaries, or right? It's this idea of two-sector economy, where one sector, which is the energetic one, supports all the other ones that are non-energetic. Now, this is not an intertemporal framework, but if for whatever reason the agent increases its power capacity, the amount of prime movers it has, well, the equilibrium quantity of energy goods is going to increase. The energy surplus is going to be larger, and so the utility is going to increase. There are going to be incentives that I cannot make explicit this presentation that are going to lead in the long run to a convergence towards this last point, var theta. That var theta represents the long-run steady state of the agent, where the marginal energy surplus is 0, where the marginal energy return over investment is 1, where energy surplus has been maximized, and where also utility has been maximized. How much time do I have left?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to have to rush through fast. Obviously, that steady state is not steady, because if you have efficiency breakthroughs, it's going to go down. If you have depletion, it's going to go up. Fossil fuels are constantly in this tension between efficiency, making the whole curve go down, and depletion making the whole curve go up. And there are an array of issues regarding not only efficiency, but stating the problem in terms of prime movers, dealing with non-energy goods, and minimizing energy transfers. but we ain't got time for that because our objective was to think about the proportionality between prices and embodied energy. And up to here, we don't have prices because we don't have markets. An autarkic agent does not face prices. So to introduce exchange, we have to think about this autarkic agent and put another one beside it and allow them to exchange. And following conventional economic rationale, we can define that there will be gains of trade that are specified as net increases in energy surplus derived from the lowering of embodied energy that specialization allows, right? Comparative and relative advantages lead agents to specialize in the goods for which they must transfer less energy to produce, and that frees up energy surplus to produce non-energy goods and increase unambiguously utility for both if the commodity price is between the reservation commodity price of both agents. And those are the limits, right? Now, although we can define the limits of the commodity price, that is the ratio at which two commodities will be exchanged, we can't define the specific number because the agents are both monopolies of the good they produce and monopsonies of the other one. So you have all these contingent situations that define what will be the specific commodity price. Nonetheless, if you allow competition, that is, bring in many agents just equal to A and B, well, you will eventually have a collapse of that range towards the minimum relative marginal embodied energy of both goods. And that will be the commodity price by simple tatonement, which is the process of iterative offerings and demands that lead to the collapse of range of commodity prices to the minimum relative marginal embodied energy of both. Now, this can be even generalized further to include many types of agents and many types of goods. And what we find is that following the same logic of Nash equilibrium tatonement, what we find is that for any good, the relevant marginal embodied energy is the marginal producer's marginal embodied energy. When you include a lot of producers, you have these market curves where different producers have different marginal embodied energy curves, right? And it's the marginal producer's marginal embodied energy that will define the commodity price for that good. And that's PC, right? Commodity price is equal to relative marginal embodied energy. Those are the gamma M's. We define this ratio as the rule of exchange, which tells us that agents exchange equivalent amounts of embodied energy at the margin, and that can be very relevant for equity issues, right? At the margin, and only at the margin do embodied energy exchanges equate. The second one is that this tells us that energy's lowest cost here in production can have nothing to do with energy's importance in the productive process. If you have a low-powered society and embodied energies are relatively low, the price of energy goods can be quite low, but that doesn't take into consideration that those same goods are providing all the energy surplus that allows for the whole economy to run. Now, coming to full circle, hopefully very fast, we know that commodity prices are very inconvenient. You don't want to buy a cow with bread or a house with fish, right? So in sufficiently sophisticated societies define general equivalents, which can be cows, but cows for everything, right? Not to buy bread. Or gold or cowries, or there are an array of historical examples of what is real money. The thing is, you define all goods in terms of this general equivalent. So you say, well, everything in terms of cows. So how much does a bread cost? Well, 100th of a cow. How much does a house cost? 5 cows. Well, so I know what a bread costs in terms of houses through cows. And that simplifies the exchange process dramatically. And that allows us to talk about real prices, which is the ratio between marginal embodied energy of a given good in terms of the marginal embodied energy of the general equivalent. Because, importantly, the general equivalent is a good that must be produced and thus has marginal embodied energy. That's the real price. And now, finishing up, real money is also inconvenient, right? Trying to go buy a house with cows, or bread with, right, calories, or with lingots of gold. So more sophisticated economies define also a representation of this general equivalent. And then we come finally to the money that we are used to talking about. Euros, dollars, pesos, right? They are historically a representation of real money. So that was the gold standard back in the day. And you can define nominal money's purchasing power as applying the rule of exchange between real money and nominal money. So that gamma S is a synthetic embodied energy, which depends on that expression there. It depends on the marginal embodied energy of real money and the relative quantities of both type of money. So here's an expression for inflation, and to finish it up, what we find is that the representation of real price in terms of nominal money will be given by the equation up there, and if we take the ratio of those, we have that relative prices, nominal prices, dollars or euros, is going to be proportional to relative marginal embodied energy. I'm past my time, right?
Another half minute.
Okay, so fast highlights. The model follows conventional economic methodology in terms of being strictly adherent with marginal analysis. The novelty is focused on the proposal of an energy budget constraint as the determinant and constraint on the consumption possibilities of an autarkic agent. And that is based on revisiting the ideas of what goods are and the role of energy transfers and material rearrangements. Prime movers are central in this process, as they are the systems with which agents can transfer energy. And marginal energy surplus also is fundamental as it determines the long-term growth prospects of an agent. One nice thing that I love about this perspective is that it avoids the use of capital. All this, never talk about capital. I think capital is a highly undefined term that should be avoided in a more rigorous discussion about economics. And also allows the introduction of undetermined human behavior due to energy surplus. Well, the energetics dimension has a very strict dynamic, right? If you don't have energy in, you're not going to be able to reproduce the process over time. But what you do with energy surplus, that is totally undetermined. You can use it to build universities, space stations, or huge militaries. And that's where politics come in, and that's where undetermined human behavior comes in. That kind of connects with Prigoghine's idea, right? That when you have systems far away from thermal equilibrium, then is when freedom appears. The main result is that short-term growth is achieved by primary accumulation, but long-term growth is constrained by marginal energy surplus, or marginal EROI. There's no unique EROI, but a marginal EROI curve that depends on the level of production. Market prices are just a social representation with which we can relate to regarding embodied energy of goods, and relative market prices are proportional to relative marginal embodied energies. And I'm way out of time, so thank you.
You're not way out of time. We do have a couple
by drilling more wells, and in the process, we're transferring carbon to the atmosphere. Renewable stock, renewables, the stock is basically extendable indefinitely, but there's a constraint on flow. Over time, long run, shrinking finite stock raises the prices of extraction. With renewables, in principle, costs can fall over time, up to a point, but you still have the biophysically constrained flow. So that's kind of the context. That's the problem area that I'm working in. An overview of this talk. I'm going to start by talking about the neoclassical theory to explain why I'm not using it. Then I'm going to go on and talk about two concepts: evolutionary approaches to technological change and cost share induced technological change. Then I'll introduce the theory. That's where the mathematics gets fairly intense. And then I come back and apply this model that I've developed to natural resources, and then I'll conclude. And this is based on a couple of papers. So first, the neoclassical theory. Neoclassical production function, I think we're familiar with this. Output is equal to a factor, total factor productivity, times labor to some exponent in capital. Overall, if you scale up everything, capital and labor together, you get constant returns to scale, but in each factor by itself, you get diminishing returns. This is thought of as a schedule of production possibilities. If you mix labor and capital in different degrees, you can get different levels of output. And firms then allocate labor and capital, maximize profits. Growth is given by this. I'm using a hat. Oh my, the dot on top comes out as an ampersand on this PC. Very well. That's x dot over x. So x hat, that's a growth rate. That means a growth rate. So GDP growth is total factor productivity growth plus that coefficient A times growth in labor plus 1 minus A times growth in the capital stock. And according to the theory, neoclassical theory, using marginalist calculus, factors are paid their marginal contribution to output, so that parameter A has to equal omega, the wage share of total compensation. And empirically, it's found to do that, more or less, if you're careful. So some problems. First, these two terms, these two factors that go in there, capital and labor, they're both highly heterogeneous. Okay, the capital is any number of things, and labor, it's not, you don't have just a uniform worker. And given that heterogeneity, Franklin Fisher over a series of papers showed that it's unlikely to the point of impossibility that you could actually come up with a well-defined aggregate neoclassical production function. Moreover, in the Cambridge capital controversies between Cambridge, UK, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, the idea is that that aggregate K is calculated using a price, because you have to combine all those heterogeneous inputs using something in common, which is money, but the price is determined by the marginal contribution of aggregate capital. There's a circularity, and that can't be resolved. So that was Sraffa's contribution. So why do people believe it? They believe it because it works, meaning that if you go and do a statistical fit, you get high R squared if you're careful about what you do. But there's something about those statistical tests. So I'm going to start with another set of equations. Here I'm expressing output, GDP, the value of output, as wages plus profits. Okay, this is from the national accounts, setting aside a bunch of other stuff, taxes and imports and exports. But wages and profits, and by definition, so this is just accounts and definitions. By definition, the unit wage is total wage bill divided by labor. By definition, the profit rate is total profits divided by the value of capital. Those are dots. Y dot equals W dot L plus WL dot plus R dot K plus RK dot. That's just standard calculus. Fortunately, now I'm switching to the growth rates. So you get this. GDP growth is equal to this expression, and all I did was I divided the time derivatives by the values. So W dot divided by W, that becomes W hat, and then I multiply by it. And that factor there, WL, that's the total wage, divided by the total output, so that's the wage share. And the profits divided by total output, that's 1 minus the wage share, the profit share. And so we rearrange and we get this expression. Well, that's exactly the same as that growth expression I gave you before, if you identify total factor productivity growth with that expression. The regressions aren't testing a relationship. They're confirming an identity. This was shown a year after Solo's growth model. It was reestablished that by forgetting the name, but it was reestablished by Sheikh. It was actually discovered by Samuelson. It's been shown over and over, and it is not taken into account. Phelps Brown, that's right, that was first shown. And Felipe and McCombie have been working on this quite a lot. So I'm not interested in the neoclassical production function. Not going to use it because it has no theoretical basis, and the statistical tests aren't actually testing for it. So there's no justification for using it. And the neoclassical theory of technological change is also problematic for a couple of reasons. First, because it's based on that neoclassical production function. And second, because it requires a level of knowledge, general knowledge, about the technological frontier that I'm not entirely comfortable with. And I like evolutionary theory better, in which firms know their own technology, they have some knowledge of what their rivals are doing. They're continually trying to raise profits in the short run by looking for small improvements, little innovations that will cut costs at given prices and wages. But it doesn't last. They have a temporary monopoly position, but it's really temporary for most technologies, since most of those improvements aren't actually necessarily protected, and they're kind of easy to copy without violating patents. So as the technologies are adopted or imitated by rivals, you have these effects. Workers might demand a share in the gains. Less possible now than in the past, but can happen. Some firms lower their prices, eroding the excess profits, and so you get an adjustment, and then the firms start all over again. So I'll show this in diagram form. You innovate to save on costs. Those diffuse to other firms, those innovations. Competitive pressures lead to changes in prices and wages. And you're back where you started on the technological treadmill. And this brings me to the topic of cost share induced technological change. So, some notation. I'm going to use throughout productivity in general. I'm going to use the nu for productivity as output divided by the quantity of some input. And the cost share is the price of that multiplied by the quantity divided by the value of output. I'm doing everything in real terms. So here, real means relative to the price level of GDP. So that's why I just have a price on the numerator. It's divided by the price on the denominator, and that gives me my real price. And note that the cost share is just the real price divided by the productivity. Special cases, I'll use kappa for capital productivity and pi for the profit share, lambda for labor productivity, and omega for the wage share, and for natural resources, a nu for the productivity and rho for the cost share. Okay, here is the statement of cost share induced technological change. This is the idea. When the cost share for an input goes up, firms make a stronger effort to reduce their use of that particular input. By reducing use, that means that they're improving their productivity. And again, I emphasize that there's a two-step process. First, there's innovation at constant wages and prices. They're trying to get a temporary monopoly. then competition changes the cost shares. Productivity growth is, of course, limited by technological potential. This idea has a long history. Ricardo discussed it back in the early 19th century. Marx, slightly later than Ricardo, and he pointed out this issue of competition changing the situation. Hicks was really explicit about it, and a lot of people, both neoclassical and heterodox, kind of start from Hicks, and then all these other people, Caldor, Kennedy, Samuelson, etc., etc. And
Isn't this also Schumpeterian?
it's, the evolutionary is Schumpeterian. Cost share induced technological change is more these guys. And you end up with an equilibrium seeking dynamic. Okay, so you start with cost share induced technological change. The cost share goes up and the growth rate of the productivity goes up. You make more of an effort. If the productivity goes up, if you accelerate that, you're using less of something, and other things being equal, that tends to reduce the cost of that. There's less demand, so other things equal, you reduce that. And so what you get is, in this dynamic, a tendency, since you've got a positive influence and a negative influence, you look at that causal loop diagram, you get overall a negative feedback loop, and so you tend towards constant cost shares and productivity growth rates as a stable, as the equilibrium position in this system. And that's actually what we tend to observe. It's not the neoclassical price mechanism for equilibration. So you come to an equilibrium, but it's not that price. There is, though, a center of gravitation, which is interesting from a classical perspective. And it's not just for resources, it works for any input. The values of those equilibrium values depend on technological potential, so that's more physically based, and on wage and price setting behavior, and that's more socially and institutionally based. So it's all in there. And when you've got more than two inputs, you can see some transient perverse behavior where you actually get these behaviors flipped around. This first one, rising cost share but a falling productivity growth rate. It's theoretically possible. It can be seen, but it's transient because it can't persist for economic reasons. All right, so now I want to say a word about decoupling. So, resource cost share. It's the resource cost divided by the resource times the resource divided by GDP is, as I showed before, the price divided by the productivity. Okay? And at equilibrium, this is a constant. Therefore, if these are growing or shrinking, they're doing it at the same rate, because that ratio has to stay the same. So, absolute decoupling means that the productivity growth rate exceeds the GDP growth rate. That's what decoupling means, literally. And from this, we therefore conclude that for absolute decoupling to occur, the price has to grow faster than GDP. But you don't expect that with abundant resources. So I offer this as an example, as an explanation for why we have not seen absolute decoupling in the past. It can happen with a resource task in which you're steadily raising the price, and it can happen with constrained resources. Okay, now I'm going to get into some theory. This will become mathematically intensive, but I do want to show it because personally I like to see what's behind the stuff I'm putting forward, so I'm going to do that now. I'm going to start with Okishio's viability criterion. So the idea here is that if a firm is going to adopt an innovation, that innovation has to raise the profit rate. So that thing about the temporary monopoly, if a potential innovation coming from the lab, no matter how excited the R&D department is about what they've done, if it's not actually going to give a temporary monopoly, they'll say no and won't implement it. Sticking just with capital and labor for now. So we've got the profit rate is profits divided by capital. Divide each of those by GDP, and you get the profit rate times capital productivity. The capital productivity, if it's only wages and capital, is 1 minus the wage share. And the wage share is the wage over labor productivity. Okay, so this all came from what I showed before. So starting with R is equal to, this last expression that we got. Look at growth rates. Growth rate in R is growth rate in kappa plus, and here you're holding the wage fixed, so just looking at lambda, and you end up with this. This ratio is omega. 1 minus omega is pi, so you end up with this. That expression.
What was lambda again?
Lambda is labor productivity. So if you require that the innovation raise the profit rate, then this equals 0, multiply through by pi, and you get this right here. That's Okishio's viability theorem. Now there was a neat little paper by a couple of economists, Dumenil and Levy, and they were asking, why is there a bias in technological improvements? Why is labor productivity rising while capital productivity tends not to rise? So labor productivity over time tends to rise. Marx said capital productivity would have to fall, but in fact, what was observed by the 20th century was that it tended to be kind of constant, and it actually, with more recent data than either of them had, it tends to fluctuate but with no trend. That's kind of what we see. So why do you have that bias? And they started with this idea that, okay, it's an evolutionary theory. Suppose you set the R&D department out and they just find whatever they can. And there's some probability of finding it. And most often they fail completely. They find something that reduces both capital and labor productivity, because these are the growth rates and that's the intercept. But, so this is, I've drawn it so that it's symmetric around the axis, so it's completely unbiased. But we've got this Okishio viability line that R has to increase. So they can only be looking up in this part, up here. So you get biased technological change. Here you've actually got a negative growth rate for capital productivity, a la Marx, and a positive one for labor. Okay, pretty cool. And if you change this line by changing the profit rate, profit share, and therefore the wage share, say you increase it from 0.3 to 0.4, it changes Okishio's viability line. And therefore, it changes the growth rate in productivities. So it all comes from this probability of discovery plus Okishio's viability line. And what you find is that if you increase the wage share, it increases the growth rate in labor productivity. If you increase the profit share, it increases the growth rate in capital productivity. This was really lovely. This is a really nice thing. So there are some strong benefits from the paper by Dumenil and Levy. And The micro story is reasonable. It's about the firm. What does the firm do? They want to get these temporary profits at constant profit prices and wages, but then and through a random and incremental search, just looking in the neighborhood of what they're already doing, and then competition brings the prices and wages to new levels that affects the cost share. A bias arises naturally from the Okishio viability theorem, and as has been shown by others, including Julius, it provides a cost share induced theory of technological change that you can use in a bunch of different models. Julius used a classical and a post-Keynesian and a Marxian model. But there are some limitations. That symmetric, circularly symmetric probability for discovery with labor and capital only is a constraint. Also, despite those limitations, as Julius pointed out, he said, and you don't give me any constraints on the functional form of these relationships. And then something I'm not going to discuss here, but that I do resolve is how to reconcile with the Kaldor-Verdoorn law, which is a quite well-established empirical regularity. And so what I'm going to show now is how I dealt with these, except for this fourth one. So first, Okishio's viability theorem, it extends very readily to any number of inputs. And so you impose this and you get, you know, I had pi times kappa hat plus omega times lambda hat. That generalizes to cost shares times productivity growth rates are greater than 0, where I've added this in. So I've done this. They limited to labor and capital inputs. I've generalized. Okay. Now, average productivity change. That's in that bit of the circle. So for Duménil and Lévy, it was that bit of the circle that was above the Okishio viability line, up here. And what I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, I've got that growth rate, I've got the probability distribution, which is this, and I'm imposing the Okishio viability criterion using a step function. It's equal to 1 if sigma dot nu hat is positive, it's equal to 0 otherwise. So H for Heaviside, that's the Heaviside step function. And the only place where the cost share shows up is in this step function. It's Okishio's viability criterion. So I take the derivative, I'm taking the derivative of the step function. The derivative of the step function is a delta function. So I end up with that. I take this derivative, I'm calling that a matrix M, and I get this expression right now. So, so I've now generalized beyond that symmetric circular probability distribution. And M turns out to be the interesting quantity. So some features of the matrix. First, this is the expression I just got. Swap those indices, and it looks exactly the same. So it's symmetric. It's positive. Multiply this by xj, multiply that by xi, and sum. Those are exactly the same expression, so it's squared. That's positive, or non-negative. So is that. So everything's non-negative. And it's semi-definite. That's really irritating that it didn't work right there. Those are, I don't even know what those are. But doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Oh, I know what that is. That's showing that this expression right here, that's actually a curly brace. My goodness. That's this expression times the delta function. It's 0. The delta function is 0 unless its argument is 0. So if you multiply by its argument, it's 0 everywhere. So in contrast to Julius's critique, I have placed constraints on the cost share productivity change relationship. All right. I have, according to my clock, 3 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to introduce natural resources. So, and I'm going to introduce a toy model. So first of all, I introduced this right here. Now, why is this nice? Because it's a viable in matrix. Okay. If I were to take those derivatives, I would find that this is symmetric and positive semi-definite in the right way. And this is not enough because this is about the innovation step. I also need price and wage setting. So I'm going to say, I'm going to use target return pricing, in which firms say that they want a particular rate of return. So if CAPA changes, if their capital productivity changes, if it goes down like Mark said, then they bump up their profit share to make sure they maintain their profit rate. This is something that more or less happened from the 80s onward. Before that, it was a different situation. I'm going to set an exogenous real resource price. Now, in the paper, I don't do that. I put in some assumptions about price response to demand and some other factors. But here I'm going to keep it simple. And labor is a residual. It's complicated looking. Who cares? Because at this point, I've got rho, I've got pi, I've got A, I calculate it. Fine. So, I set some values for the parameters. I say, as has historically been the case over a long time, up through the late 90s, aside from the oil crisis, which could have been said to be mainly political, the real price barely budged. So I'm going to say the real price was flat. And with these assumptions, I get some reasonable things. I've got labor productivity growing at around 2% a year, constant capital productivity according to Kaldor's law. I therefore find that this is 0, and I've got some reasonable looking cost shares. Now I'm going to assume that the price starts rising, as it has been doing since 2000 more or less. Labor productivity goes down, profit and resource share go up, resource productivity increases, growth increases, and labor productivity growth slows. So how does it do? I have 2 seconds. So I'm going to look at these 2 periods where energy was increasing, where the oil price was increasing, and let's take a look. With the first one, bam, the shares of gross domestic income, so omega fell once that happened. It kept falling because why not? I mean, once it's falling, you've got some political momentum. Great, I can keep that falling. But it fell more steeply when the prices rose again. Labor productivity growth slowed abruptly, and then it slowed again here and continued to slow. So more stuff is going on. It's not the only dynamic. In that first period, exergy intensities started dropping much faster than they had in the past, and it's much less visible down here. Again, you kick in some changes, but once this had ended, it wasn't falling as fast. So that seems kind of nice to me. Rather than a neoclassical production function, from a post-Keynesian perspective, I think in terms of production regimes where with a Leontief production function, where I might be limited in a number of different ways. And you can say, okay, a developing economy with a dual structure, you have one set of constraints. A mature stock-limited economy like we got now, you got another one. And what we're heading to is a mature flow-limited economy, which is a different beast altogether. But I would argue that this theoretical framework can translate to that. So conclusions. Characteristics of fossil resources have given us high labor productivity and wage growth, low resource productivity, resource. I see you, garbage. And that's consistent with this theory. Dwindling fossil resources and switch to flow limited resources could give us low labor productivity and wage growth, high resource productivity and resource price growth and high profit share, GDP growth constrained by the flow of renewables. We can live on renewables indefinitely into the future, potentially with a high level of technological sophistication, but the economy would look quite different, and these are the reasons why I would say thank you.
Gail, if you could cue yours up.
Just to give you a little bit more background, I got involved with this back in starting about 2005. I started writing on my own blog, then I got involved in the oil drum, and in late 2007, I could see the economy was going straight downhill. Well, I could see what was happening, and I wrote an article on the oil drum forecasting essentially the collapse we saw in late 2008. And after that happened, Charlie Hall invited me to come and give a talk at the 2009 Biophysical Economics conference, and then various other things happened. There were many people at that, like Professor Fung, and then eventually I gave other talks other places. I ended up writing up a paper about it, explaining it was really a twofold problem. It wasn't just the oil prices, it was also a debt crisis. And so what happened was I ended up meeting with all kinds of people from all strands of energy insight, or maybe not even energy, maybe more physics, all kinds of strange different areas. And on both the oil drum and on Our Finite World, there's a place for comments. So all of these people would write to me and say, if you want a more complete theory, you should look at X. So I'd go look at X. So what ended up happening was I had started trying to put together something that was not really the biophysical economics theory that everybody hears. It was, well, what are other people seeing from other disciplines, and what does this look like? Well, it turns out it looks fairly different from what people here have been assuming is the case. So it makes it a little bit difficult to try to explain, but I will try. Anyway, so this is an outline of the points that, with some luck, I can go through at least some of them. Anyhow, how the economy works is an energy-based, self-organized system. Today's economy is following the path of early economies that collapsed. Per capita energy consumption needs to rise. It's not something that people have really looked at. We can't count on energy prices rising even if EROI falls. And this is something that, we've had several speakers who have assumed that the prices are going to go up. This is not at all obvious. Growing debt plays many important roles. I think people tend to discount this. The financial system is just terribly important. And in today's world, you can't simply forgive debt and start over. What it ends up doing is it collapses the whole system. So let me go. So the first section. Now this is something, the entire universe seems to be organized by flows of energy. I think most people here have been educated to talk about we have a closed system and we're running out of a finite amount of energy, and this is the way everything is, and this is our big problem of the world, is this closed system we're working in. And what seems to be the case, which is looking at it from a different perspective, is the whole universe acts very much like an open system. If you go back and look at it, it started with the very smallest atoms, and then after the Big Bang, it gradually worked up to more and more energy-intense systems. Bigger atoms, then molecules, then whatever. Eric Chasson has various charts that look sort of like this, but it goes, the self-organization goes towards galaxies, stars, planets, plants, animals, and then he's saying he has this as an energy density rate. The brains within animals are even more energy intense, and what he calls society is what you and I would call an economy, is the most energy dense. But there's this trend, it's this flow of energy that pushes everything towards higher energy density. And we all say, oh, everybody should just change the way they act, but there's this flow and this force that we don't really understand that that causes this rise in complexity in nature. And now if we look at humans, what seems to have happened is that humans are different from animals because we have learned to control the energy of fire. And in fact, we learned to control it over 1 million years ago. And this control of fire had a number of different kinds of impacts. One of the big ones was that we could cook our food. And when we cooked our food, we didn't need to chew it as long. We could get better nutrition from it. And our bodies could adapt in such a way that we didn't need as big teeth and big jaws and a big digestive system. So what happened was there was more energy for a brain. But this was all related to this issue of the fact that we had control of fire. And of course, this is what gave us the advantage over these other animals. And we started back in hunter-gatherer times of killing off the other species. We were burning down forests in order to find the animals we wanted to eat. So it's not something that's a fossil fuel problem. It's a problem with the fact that humans have control of energy and have had it since hunter-gatherer days. And so, of course, this advantage allowed human population to rise, and that fossil fuel just added to this advantage. And so what happened as we grew and as population grew, then there needed to be a way to add more energy. So the question is, what do you do? And the big thing that comes along is complexity. And I'm sure all of you have heard of Joseph Tainter and the fall of complex societies. And what happens here is that complexity has its own limits. But this complexity that gives you different roles. It's what about you add more technology and you have more promises, and it allows you to accommodate all of this additional energy, but it also changes the whole nature of the system. You end up with more hierarchical arrangement. It's not just everybody's a hunter-gatherer. You gradually add more and more roles. You have a big government, and you'll have layers that come on. And so what happens, as you add complexity, you have this pecking order. And what happens to try to make this growing thing is you keep pushing more and more energy towards the top. The governments keep getting bigger and bigger. They add NAFTA, they add whatever, and then there's the largest corporation. They tend to grow through globalization. And you end up with the people with the advanced training. They get higher positions within these corporations, so they're the ones who get the big pieces of the output. And what tends to happen to make the system collapse is this thing, the people with no special training and the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, they tend to get left out. They may lose their jobs altogether, or they don't get paid enough. And they are really the big buyers in the system. They're the ones that need to, there's so many of them, like if it's 80% or 90%, they all have to have homes to live in. They need some kind of transportation. But if their wages go down too far because of NAFTA or because of anything else, that's what causes the big collapses that we see. I show here one chart I've given as an example of how I see the economy working, and it's a self-organized system, and it builds on itself. you have at any point in time a group of businesses and a group of consumers, and you have an energy supply, and you have all of these different things. And new businesses form when they see opportunities, and then the consumers decide what they're going to buy based on what the others, what products are available. And of course you have laws and taxes, and all of these things are changing and they feed back on each other. And the thing that happens that becomes a problem is what I just mentioned before, and I have it down at the bottom, that the non-elite workers, this big group of people, are the ones who are both the primary workers in the system and the primary consumers in the system. And if you don't get enough money down to them, the whole thing goes for plunk. And this is a different way I visualize the economy. And so we have the inputs on the far left end, and then we have the basically entropy products on this side, and then we have the economy that kind of goes like a rocket straight up. And so, you know, and there's tools and technology allows us to use the minerals and the energy, and they're important, but there's all these other pieces too. So there's a temptation to say, you know, well, if we just model this other energy, that gets us far enough, and it does for certain purposes. But in some purposes, you really have to be looking at the other pieces. So what causes the economy's ultimate problem? Is it running short of oil, or is it inadequate total fuel for that rocket? The economy grows too slowly, so there are too few jobs. Or is it the entropy issues that I show coming off the end, like just too much debt? The question I don't think peak oilers have asked is, when does this problem really come? Does it come when it peaks, or does it come when at some sooner point? What causes the economic, is there an economic problem that causes oil to peak? And in fact, coal and natural gas and everything else at the same time. This physics story has been changing since the 1970s. The 1970s story was most systems are energetically closed. We run out of energy supplies. I know John Shramsky's big article, one of them is the closed system approach, and that's the standard approach. But this what happens really is the economy, or the system, operates as an open system, and these self-organized things that are various types of things that are formed by self-organizations are not permanent. We know the sun is not going to last forever. We know the earth is not going to last forever. We know humans are not going to live forever. And hurricanes don't either. But what happens is that economies can't last forever either. And so, you know, this is why we need to look a little bit farther. The way I see it is that EROI is like a flat map. It's looking primarily at the inputs, and sometimes you need a three-dimensional model, or 4 or 5, just because there are other considerations. And of course, we don't stop using flat maps in the three-dimensional world. The issue is that we have to be very careful when we're using EROI, because you may get very distorted results if, you know, as we saw before, there are a lot of problems that can cause a particular option to fail, and it may be one of those entropy problems, or it may be the fact that you can't get enough out in total that causes this new substitute to fail. And the fact that you are choosing to look at only one piece of the problem, which happens to be the big piece, for fossil fuels, can get you into trouble. Now, there's been a fair amount of research as to what's happened to economies that have collapsed. I've sometimes, if any of you read my articles, I've talked about secular cycles by Church and Nevada, and they look at a number 8 in one of their books, talking about how specifically these economies collapsed. And the big thing they're looking at or concerned about is carrying capacity, which is pretty close to annual energy consumed divided by population. It's what we talk about with animals, but with humans, you've got to add on what the value of the forests they're getting or the fossil fuels they're getting. But there's a per capita energy consumption that needs to be higher. The pattern that they follow, they talk about is that an economy will come upon a new resource, for instance, through winning a war or cutting down trees. Well, once they've got this new big area, they can grow rapidly for a while. But then what happens is that they reach the carrying capacity. And when they reach the carrying capacity, they start a stagflation period. And this is where they start running into some more problems. And then eventually collapse occurs. And there's a timing involved in this. The way they see this is that, well, I say that the growth period goes for over 100 years, and what I show on my graph is that for these 8 economies they were looking at, it was like 180 years. But it goes for quite a while that you get several generations who can use up the resources that are available within that area before they have to win a war against somebody else and expand to a new area or whatever it is. But then after they use up those resources, they get to a period they can add complexity, but that complexity causes problems. This is where you get to wage disparity. And then once you've got too much wage disparity, then you get the crisis period and the intercycle. And so I talk a little bit about this, and debt defaults, of course, come in this. One of the big things that happens with collapse is that governments can't collect enough taxes because that 80% are so poor. The governments depend on having enough people to collect the taxes from. The businesses can run away to a different country. This is what we've had problems with. And so you can't count on getting taxes from the businesses. You got to get it from the low-income people. But if they're too low income, you can't do that. And then, of course, workers succumb to epidemics as they become poorer. Is peak oil a new and different problem? I don't really think so. It really is an issue, whether it's, what we talk about, it's energy consumed divided by population that gets to be important. And back in those days, well, it varied whether it was the numerator or the denominator, but the population, the fact the population was growing was enough by itself to cause the economy to collapse. But of course there was also erosion of the topsoil and added salinity to the soil, so there were a lot of different things pushing towards collapse. And of course, now we started using fossil fuels over 200 years ago, so we're kind of following the same timeline. And if you look at it, our big growth in energy use was stopped in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Once the growth in energy use stopped, we had to start using more and more complexity, more and more debt to try to fix the situation. And so what happens is that there's a big increase in wage disparity. And what happened in the earlier years, if you look at that first graph I show over here, you see that the wages went up. These are inflation-adjusted wages, and even for the lower wage people, when we were adding lots of energy to the economy, it was going through as wages. But then between 70 and 80, 1970 and 1980, it leveled off. But then we started with the complexity stuff. The complexity stuff is the stuff that, you know, sends more money to the top and less to the bottom. And so what happens, this is one that's now, is this Piketty graph that you see here, the second one I'm showing, where we're back to the 1920s situation with a similar amount of wage disparity, because we've pushed the economy, as we've added more and more of this complexity, we pushed it so that the owners of these big machines are the ones that get the big output of the economy, and the poor workers are competing with people in Africa or India or something that will work for $20 or $30 a month. The question is, how fast does the energy consumption need to rise? And if you look at the graph, the energy consumption is consistently rising. But we can look at it on a per capita basis as well. And what you see here is that there are a couple of obvious flat periods in it. One of them was the 1920 to 1940 period, and another was the 1980 to 2000 period. And let's see, the 1920 to 1940 period is, remember, this is the World War I, World War II Depression period. This is not what you want a rerun of. And of course, this is when we raised tariffs before. It was Hitler, it was the Holocaust, and the World War II was what got us out of it, because that was what they used to pump up demand and get wages back down to the bottom level again. The 1980 to 2000 period was different because that followed the period where we had already shifted to smaller cars and we were doing all kinds of things to change our energy use. But what happened was the Soviet Union, you know, we didn't need as much oil as we did reduce the size of the cars, and we became more efficient. But that lowered the prices, and so some oil exporter was going to have to go. Well, it ended up it was the Soviet Union, and their central government collapsed in 1991. This is following the standard collapse kind of situation, where it's the central government that collapses. They can't collect enough tax dollars. And now, since 2010, what we're seeing is another flat period forming. And the flat period is the kind of thing that you see, that you expect to start seeing the same kind of problems arising. To me, this flat period has some similarities back to the 1920 to 1940 period. It's not one where we've gotten the flat period by, you know, our conscious, you know, moving to much smaller cars. Where we got the flat period from was by reducing the coal consumption. And a big piece of that was because of the pollution problems. So, you know, everybody's got their eyes so focused on oil, they can't look at coal. You know, sort of like, oh, yeah, oil is our problem, it's our only problem. Well, no, it isn't. You have to keep the total energy supply. And so what I see is that you really have to have increasing per capita energy consumption. And what happens is that this energy is really related to carrying capacity. Logically, you would need it sort of to be equivalent to what you need for that energy goes back to each of these workers. But what happens as you're having this disparity kind of thing happening is that you have several different things that are taking energy supply away from what the individual workers are going to be able to use. Part of it's this diminishing returns kind of thing. It's the EROI problem. Part of it is just the fact that when you're adding all of these machines that are used by businesses and governments, that takes a big hunk of the energy supply out of the general economy where these other people will be using it. And then part of the problem has to do with the complexity. Putting more of the energy at the top means there's less for the bottom. And then we have the things with, we're going to do globalization. That means there's a lot of energy used in the long distance transport. So what happens is you end up with these poor workers becoming literally poorer and poorer. I put together a little bit different chart of how 10-year averages on how oil production or energy production, energy consumption has changed by 10-year periods starting from 1820. And what you can see is that population has been, in early periods the population growth is pretty slow. And then we gradually increase the population growth as we had more energy supply. And then what happens is that in these periods where we had peaks, that's when the economy did really pretty well. In the 1910 period, that was when we had the early streetcars, and people started getting we started putting some tractors out for farmers to use. And then the post-war boom, we had people moving to the suburbs, and many families could afford a car for the first time. And then we kind of ran short on that oil, and then China saved us for a while. So we had these big pieces, and as I looked at that, I saw the little dip, so I looked to see what was going on, and of course, we had some panics back in the time we had a dip in the 1860 period that was almost too small to look up and to show in the graph before. One of the concerns I have now is that China's energy production has been collapsing. I haven't looked at the new numbers that just came out. I'm pretty sure that the coal is up this year for various reasons. But what happens is if China is producing less, we need more elsewhere, and that becomes a concern. This is an issue that people don't think about. We can't count on energy prices rising even if EROI falls. Roger Fouquet has this chart where he shows that the price of energy services tends to fall, and it falls quite steeply. And let me see. And what happens, of course, is that the cost share keeps falling. What happens too is that we have a situation where no price works. That the price is it's either too high for the consumers or it's too low for the producers. It's both of those things. And you use debt to pull it up, and more debt to pull it up. Anyhow, I don't really have time to go through some of these things. Maybe I can go to my conclusions and see the things. The resource limits seem likely to play out as an economic collapse rather than following the peak oil scenario. Worldwide, energy consumption needs to grow more rapidly than population, or fighting over resources is likely. In the 1920 to 1940 period, we hit a period when economic energy consumption was increasing only as the population growth. This was a dreadful period, and it may be similar to, it seems to be similar to what we're running into now. And in fact, I'm concerned about another crash similar to, but worse than, the 2008 crash. We can't count on high energy prices as limits hit. The prices tend to go down. One of the slides I skipped was showing that the supply and demand model that we look at is two-dimensional, and we need a three-dimensional model or four or five-dimensional models. The fact that the economists have that particular model is not right near limits. It's a different situation near limits. The way I see it, we should expect actual fossil fuel extraction to be less than estimated by Hubbert linearization. Low prices may cause governments of oil exporters to collapse. Financial problems are likely to reduce the amounts consumers can afford. There's no possibility of a steady state economy. The only possibility is it goes up or it goes down. And if it goes down, it can go down pretty badly. When overall energy consumption per capita is not growing, the amount of energy services getting back to non-elite workers tends to fall. And anyhow, if I look at, you have to keep pumping up debt to keep prices rising. And that's what's allowed the whole economy to grow and prices to allowed us to pull more and more extraction out. And what happened is the last time we were able to do this without doubling up the amounts of debt was back when oil was less than $20 a barrel. So it corresponds to an EROI of 50 or more. So this is not, something that, there isn't a sustainable level within EROI. There's just so much debt. It's several times the amount of GDP that's added for any dollar of debt. And it becomes impossible without a terribly high EROI for this to happen. And I don't see walking away from debt and starting over being an option. Thank you.
We have a few minutes.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about challenges toward achieving provisioning, regulating, supporting, and cultural ecosystem services in agricultural landscapes. This is an image of a dairy farm that's very common in the New York landscape. An overview of the talk, I'll talk about multiple ways in which agricultural systems are biophysically limited, land access, ecosystem dynamics, and energy use, so issues of the water cycle, nutrient cycling, soil erosion, pollution, energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change, with the goals of how do we move towards sustainable agricultural systems, what does food security require, both from technological, social, economic perspective, which we're obviously not going to answer in this session, multifunctional landscapes, and to me an important theme is the mismatch in timescale between soil and ecological processes compared to the rate at which humans can alter managed landscapes. Throughout this talk, I'll be using other people's graphics, and there are good information of how you can find the original sources throughout. To put this into an ecosystem services framework, right now, most agricultural landscapes in the industrial world focus on provisioning services. So we are focused on optimizing yield, whether it's for food, fiber, or fuel. We can envision a future where we choose to use some of our agricultural lands to promote supporting services and regulating services, and using this graphic from Zhang et al. You can then envision a future in which the actual field itself benefits from those supporting and regulating services, improved soil fertility, water access, habitat for beneficial animals and insects. The issue of land availability, about 30% of the globe is land. Of that, 70% is habitable, and of that, 50% is already in agriculture. And the majority of it is supporting livestock agriculture. About 23% is in row cropping. Those row crops provide over 80% of human caloric needs, but animal agriculture provides about 33% of protein needs, so it's an important component of agriculture, but there is flexibility in changing what we decide to grow to meet future food security needs. What does that look like spatially? Regions in South Asia that have higher populations are already at 70 to 80% land use towards agriculture. Big exporters like the US and Brazil are in the 40% range. In terms of temporal trends, over the long course of human recorded history, we very slowly added on agricultural lands to meet expanding population, and in the last half century, we've really brought lots of land into production. So, and predominantly, or one of the big sources are low population regions like Brazil, Australia, and New Zealand, but also really expanding into everywhere possible in places with populations as well. China, India, the US have all expanded agricultural landscapes. So we're certainly land limited. We have to get smarter about how we use our land. Switching to biogeochemical cycling. Water use, this is an example from the US. Agriculture and energy are fairly equal in terms of water withdrawals in the US. However, water consumption is largely due to agriculture. So here in this case, averaging 85% of water consumption, and that's because when you distribute water on the landscape, it's susceptible to evaporation from the soil, evapotranspiration from the plant leaves, and so it's no longer available for use in the watershed by other life or for other human needs. What that looks like in the US context, in this area and in most of the eastern United States, grain-fed agriculture is rain-fed, and so the majority of the agricultural lands are not irrigated. Specialty crops are, so here we have a large apple production. If you own trees, you're not going to want to risk losing them, so you're certainly going to be keeping them irrigated when necessary, and also just to assure product quality, you'll need to irrigate. Same for vegetable production, even in this region, but it's a much lower amount of the time. In contrast, in California, where they're producing many acres of specialty crops, irrigation is necessary to support the yields that they're achieving. Other regions like the Great Plains are also very dependent on irrigation for grain agriculture, as is Eastern Washington and Oregon, also for orchard crops there. So we use a lot of irrigation. The majority is from surface water, but groundwater withdrawals are also very significant. Again, in the Great Plains, this is a really huge issue because the Ogallala watershed is being drawn down faster than it's being recharged. So indicating that our choices for cropping systems in these regions is not based in reality of the precipitation regime there. And it's estimated that once that aquifer is drawn down, it'll take 6,000 years to recharge. So that's not a sustainable system. Sources of where we can change practices, a very small percentage of the landscape is in highly efficient technologies, and so especially in produce regions for high value crops, there are technologies for using much more efficient forms of irrigation. So we can move towards those kinds of systems, as well as help share technologies internationally for places where they would be appropriate. Every country has different stressors in relation to water use. So on average, 60% of water is used for agriculture. But in places like Asia, where agriculture is a large amount of the landscape, it's more like 80%, whereas in Europe, domestic water use is much larger. So every region will have to work on water use issues in different ways. But a really pressing challenge is that we're already at 1.4 billion people living in places where withdrawal is greater than recharge, so they're already water stressed. 50% of irrigation water is lost due to evaporation and evapotranspiration. And vegetable and fruit production often does require irrigation to achieve peak yield and peak quality. And even many grain regions currently require irrigation to achieve maximum yield. So opportunities for changing management, promoting more efficient irrigation, choosing cropping system rotation that's actually in line with the climate and the soils. And then there's definitely room to focus breeding on drought tolerance and climate change issues, which has not been a priority until recently. Turning your attention to nutrient management, nitrogen and phosphorus are the two main nutrients added to agricultural systems to increase productivity. And they have slightly different issues related to improving management. Nitrogen is very abundant in the atmosphere, and once we figured out how to create nitrogen fertilizer, that has enabled us to drastically increase our yields. It is energy intensive input into agricultural systems, but it's nonetheless possible to do. Oversupply of nitrogen can be lost in multiple pathways, so nitrate leaching to watersheds, polluting aquatic systems, nitrous oxide loss to the atmosphere, and other forms of nitrogen causing air pollution. And there's an economic incentive to over-apply nitrogen in the structure of the US economy. Phosphorus, on the other hand, is also necessary for plant growth, but it's in limited supply. Oversupply also causes aquatic pollution as eutrophication. There are large stocks of phosphorus trapped in dams and sediment that's trapped in dams. It has been historically over-applied in recent decades. What does this contamination look like? This is Lake Erie, which is west of here. It's a shallow Great Lake, and so it can't absorb all of the high concentration of nutrients that come in from the surrounding agricultural landscape. In past summers, the city of Toledo has had issues with its drinking water supply due to algal blooms, making the water toxic for drinking as well as fisheries. In cases where the eutrophication is really extreme, you can get hypoxic zones where nothing can live. And that is perhaps the most common issue associated with agricultural pollution in the United States, which is our very large dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. which happens every summer. Last summer, it was almost 8,800 square miles, the largest measured, but it's been averaging 5,800 square miles since measurements began, and the target is 1,900 square miles as a goal for reduction, so we're very far off the target. And what does the landscape that generates this problem look like? These are examples of what the Corn Belt looks like. So this is an Illinois cornfield that's in bare fallow in the winter. So it spends many months, nothing growing on it. These soils were largely wetlands prior, so they're very, very, so they're high in clay. They have high organic matter content because before we drained them, they had slow decomposition. And so they create these pockets of ponding, which helps lose nutrients both to the atmosphere or through the water table. And in addition to sort of the natural background issue, we also largely, just sort of the economic reality or the logistical reality of this landscape, most farmers are applying their fertilizer in the fall. And everyone knows this is a bad idea, but this is what logistically is possible. And so nitrogen is sitting on that landscape, no plants for months and months and months. And then you have drainage channels which take the drainage water, eventually it enters the Mississippi and helps cause the dead zone. So with respect to phosphorus, it's a scarce nutrient. It's essential to all aspects of cell structure and energy. There's no substitute for it, and we can't manufacture it. It's very abundant in the Earth's crust, but it's not very available at the surface for extraction. There's a lot of uncertainty into what the actual reserves are. They're largely from commercial estimates, but various authors believe it will run out by will become unextractable by 2100. And there's anticipated to be an increased need for phosphorus globally. Only the North American and European cropping systems have been applying phosphorus on a regular basis in recent decades, or at surplus in recent decades. And the phosphorus renewal cycle is on the order of geologic timescale, so 10 to 100 million years. And you can notice when supplies are dwindling, extraction becomes more difficult. We did see a recent price spike, also concurrent with energy prices changes. We've either passed peak extraction or are approaching it based on different authors. The largest reserves are in Morocco. China, US, South Africa, Jordan also have large reserves. So we need to seriously work towards improving recycling of phosphorus in our agricultural systems and from human systems. Really recycling organic matter. The next source is going to be dredging dams when we run out of organic sources. In contrast, nitrogen, again, it's responsible for all of the increased yields we've seen in the past half century, or much of the increased yields. It is readily manufactured, so we have that technology as long as energy is available. We can also manage organic nitrogen sources, coupling livestock systems and using leguminous plants. Challenges are that biological forms of nitrogen are highly mobile, and so in inorganically fertilized systems, we currently lose about half of the fertilizer applied. The challenge with organic systems is that there is some nuance to managing them, and so there are going to be times when the availability of nitrogen is not perfectly timed with crop demand, and for certain crops that can result in much lower yields or lower quality. So we might we might need to think about breeding or choosing cropping systems that can help us ameliorate those issues. And in the U.S. context, livestock density of livestock makes it impossible to really efficiently use the manure they produce right now. So in this region, it's spread at excess just because you can't truck it to places that don't have a dairy farm next to them. It just doesn't make sense energetically. And you have to get rid of the waste somehow, so it can be over-applied closer to the cave operations. So techniques for reducing or for increasing nitrogen and phosphorus recycling, extending the vegetative cover, increases productivity of going into the ecosystem, increases soil organic matter in the soil. An active root zone really helps retain nutrients, improves the physical structure of the soil, allowing for better infiltration and water dynamics. Techniques for doing this, using cover crops is the first, the easiest technique, so we're getting rid of those bare fallows, including legumes in the system that allows for biological fixation of nitrogen. We can move towards perennial rotations, which means a plant will live for multiple years, and then more complex cropping systems in which multiple species are living in the field at the same time and have different nutrient needs, so they can be taking up nitrogen and phosphorus as it's available. Working to reduce tillage so that we can reduce erosion. There are industrial solutions that are applied in some places in the Corn Belt, so trying to optimize the application of fertilizer and using fertilizers that slow the transformation of nitrogen to prevent losses. In terms of manure usage, we just need a different scale of the distribution of animals to make it really possible to efficiently use manure. So really, in some regions here in New York, there have been efforts to work on digestion of cow manure to produce methane, and then also combining that with greenhouse operations. So you can use the manure compost, you can use the organic matter there. So there are some ways of making these systems more efficient at the current livestock densities. Some work that we did is an example of what a cover cropping system can do. So this is a meta-analysis looking at experiments in the literature. The bars are the distribution of actual data points. The icons on the top demonstrate that non-legume cover crops, so removing the winter bare fowl, reduces nitrate leaching an average of 70%, and a leguminous system reduced it on average of 40%. And in terms of crop yield, the non-legume system on average had statistically the same yield. The legume system had close to an average 10% yield decline, but then if you separate out the legume biomass that was achieved in the different systems, in places that can achieve a good legume biomass, there was no yield difference. And so one way that you can implement this is a farmer can very easily tell how well their legume did before they plant the next crop, and so you can add nitrogen when you need it. So you can combine techniques. These are organic systems that don't add nitrogen, but moving towards a sustainable cropping system, we can add nitrogen when the legume doesn't provide a sufficient amount of nitrogen. And so switching to other aspects of maintaining soil health, reducing soil erosion. Erosion is happening from water, wind, and mechanical perturbation. So environmental controls are intense rainfall and wind, which we can't control. Farmer controls are reducing bare fallow, limiting tillage, which will so decreased aggregate stability increases losses, and farming on steep terrain has a drastic result towards erosion. So management changes are, again, extending vegetation cover, keeping crop residues, landscape diversification, and avoiding steep terrain. Examples of what this looks like: if you have no-till, the soil is able to absorb water, so the water infiltrates as the precipitation event occurs. When you have a lot of tillage and very poor soil structure, you have a lot of ponding and soil particles being lost as runoff occurs. And in terms of the numbers, conventional systems on the top row have a median loss of 1.5 millimeters per year of soil. And if you look at the bottom row, and that's median, the mean is fairly high. The bottom row shows that soil production is 1/100 of a millimeter per year, so 2 orders of magnitude higher loss. Conservation agricultural techniques that reduce tillage get us a lot closer to our goals, so there are less than 1/10 of a millimeter loss. What does this look like in the U.S.? In the U.S., natural systems would be losing 21 meters per million a year. That's the natural soil erosion rate. Now, if we look at cropping systems, they're averaging, they're on target to lose 600 meters per million a year. So again, it's at least an order of magnitude. Some of the higher color regions are 2 orders of magnitude. So these 2 types of techniques are converging on, two orders of magnitude difference in conventional systems. And so we need to take soil erosion seriously, even though we've done a lot after the Dust Bowl, but there's still serious issues of erosion. So switching to energy use in agriculture, energy towards agricultural field scale production is a very, very small part, of 3 orders of magnitude lower than in terms of the total energy used in the U.S. Just for field management. You can see this is an average, certainly more complex rotation than is common in the U.S. This is a rotation in Northern Europe, and the second to the last line shows you the mean energy from nitrogen fertilization in the rotation, and it's almost half of the energy needed to make the system function. The next largest energy usage is in tractors. And so, again, compared to total energy use in other sectors, it's very small, but in terms of the system that we're used to, we still use energy for nitrogen production in most of the industrialized world. This is an example of how the organic systems, cropping system trials in Rodale, Pennsylvania, how they compare to the average conventional production in the United States. So the first 2 rows of corn and soybean are the Pennsylvania system. The 3rd row is the U.S. Conventional average. So in the corn system, the organic system had a higher yield, higher labor requirements, much lower energy input because it doesn't use nitrogen fertilizer. And so the output in the grain, the kilocalories in the grain is 7.7 times higher than the energy that went in. In this system, the conventional also does better than the U.S. average. But in corn systems, there's a range of what can be achieved in terms of the energy you get out of the system. Soybeans, in this case, the organic system had a lower yield. The energy going in is much more similar because these systems produce biological nitrogen fixation. And so there's a much narrower range in terms of the energy out or energy in. So what's the potential for legumes given current breeds and varieties? So these are the observations from our meta-analysis. And climate zone 4 is a very cold region, so it would be places like Minnesota. And so given current varieties, we weren't seeing those legumes being able to get up to what is, the red line represents the energy in the average cornfield in Illinois, really, which is a very high application rate. But those systems aren't getting enough from legume biomass, but across other climate zones where we were seeing observations where legumes did fairly well and could provide a reasonable amount of the nitrogen requirement. The table there is an example of what energy inputs look like in a typical Illinois cornfield. So again, the majority of the energy being used is because of fertilizer production, which you don't need in the legume fertilized system. Other forms of farm management have much lower energy requirements. So an entirely legume fertilized system would use half the energy of a typical system. So now changing attention to agricultural impact on greenhouse gases. So agriculture is responsible for more than half of non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, and that's largely due to nitrous oxide loss from the soil surface and methane loss through animal digestion, so enteric fermentation, and those are each about 40%.
How about water vapor?
Sorry?
How about water vapor?
So this is not my research, so I'm taking data from the CGIR. And what does, we know, so this is the same image of Illinois, bear fallows ponded in the winter. We know that different systems have different susceptibility to nitrous oxide losses. So this is some data that we're looking at to come up with better management of yield scale nitrous oxide fluxes. And so you can see as the percent clay increases, you get a much higher magnitude of nitrous oxide flux and also high variability. So we can target regions to improve nitrogen management on to reduce nitrous oxide losses. There's also a lot of choice to be made in terms of diet and what we grow. So this is a graphic that shows a kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of food, and lentils have very low footprint. In contrast, beef has a very high footprint, again, mainly from methane production in the digestion of the animal. But there's also other animal choices. Animal proteins have a much lower signature, so we can create a food system with balanced sources of protein that has a much lower greenhouse gas signal. The USDA has their 2011 publication has a number of points of concern for climate change impacts on agriculture, vulnerability of livestock to temperature stress. They're projecting that over the next 25 years, there'll be increasingly negative effects from climate change. Current stressors get exacerbated: weeds, pests, disease, multiple stressors occurring at once. So all of those, pest disease, including temperature extremes, precipitation extremes, higher frequency of weather fluctuation extremes. And so they're projecting that we will need adaptation to maintain the yields that we're capable of now, focusing more on regionally specific cropping systems and breeding specifically to handle climate change issues. In terms of smallholder farmer training, Eco Agricultural Partners has a climate change module, and there are some repeating techniques that kind of converge from multiple approaches to sustainable agriculture. They're trying to help communities understand how climate change will affect their system, working on soil nutrient management, organic matter management, tillage issues, soil, water and water management, irrigation, reducing erosion, helping with infiltration, working on agronomic practices. So what will rotations look like, helping with training on cover crops, intercropping, different crop varieties that are going to make sense in particular regions, working on integrated pest management techniques that can help with issues of pests, promoting agroforestry in order to help people diversify income and fuel wood access, as well as nutritional supplements and medicinal plants. Microclimate also changes with the use of agroforestry, so you can reduce heat stress and water stress, provide windbreaks, and then helping communities include livestock in their cropping systems. Basic principles of conservation agriculture can help provide a framework for improving agricultural management. And so the fundamental principles are to reduce soil disturbance, promote permanent soil cover, really work on nuanced rotations to help deal with a lot of the pest, disease, and weed issues, but also be envisioning flexibility so that we can appreciate that regions have their own, vary in their natural ecosystems, vary in soils and climate, so we can't think of the one management practice works everywhere. What do some of these techniques look like in the landscape? So you can interseed clover into winter wheat, and so once you harvest the wheat, the clover immediately starts growing, and so that's a way to keep permanent cover on the landscape. You can use rye cover crop instead of bare fallow, and so in the spring, the landscape will have a lot of biomass. In contrast, you could have bare fallows in the spring, which is the lower image, which is more susceptible to loss of nutrients in the soil. And when you're in systems that have applied some of these organic techniques, there's a huge difference in soil quality. So the darker soil on your right is, I think it's been an organic system for 10 years at this point. and it has a lot higher root density, a lot of better soil structure. It will allow for infiltration of water as well as just maintaining a healthy soil biology. So in summary, we need to use our available agricultural land much more effectively and think about maintaining ecosystem services. So we need to build efficient water use, think about systems that are more efficient with nutrients, especially phosphorus, think about cropping systems that work for the local ecology, and really communicate this mismatch in timescales between soil processes and human land management. Food security has many components, so it's too complex to figure this all out in a short talk. Technical aspects are a very small part of that. There's a lot of social and economic components to food security. Food distribution is one of them. We currently have this very yield-centric vision of how to manage the land. How do we move towards diverse ecosystem services? We do have flexibility to change our food system in terms of the distribution of agricultural lands in livestock and cropping systems. But multifunctional landscapes can both promote ecosystem services that benefits the land itself, but also provide farmer communities with access to nutritionally diverse food, to water that is drinkable. And it's really important when we think in a global context to think about how people will have access to nutritionally diverse diets. And so payment for ecosystem services has been one framework towards achieving this. I am not an economist, so yeah, I'm trained as an ecosystem scientist. I didn't mention that initially. I don't know what other alternatives are out there, but I'd like to thank you for your attention and sort of some thoughts about how to work. If the audience has thoughts for other economic frameworks that help us get to landscapes that provide more of what we need. So thank you for your attention.
I do have one question myself. You mentioned the Ogallala Aquifer. Do you know when it